and an attempt to understand. 2, ask sincere questions with attempt to increase comprehension and compassion. 3, speak from your own perspective and be honest and succinct. And 4, focus on the ideas rather than the person in the moments of tension. Can we all agree to those?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you again. Thanks for coming back. Last night, I talked about layers in trying to understand these issues and talk about history. And tonight, I'd like to talk about sort of the social psychology that how examining collective trauma can help us understand what has been happening. And in a very timely way, my new edition of the New York Review arrived today with an article called Living the Nakba, written by a Palestinian journalist who's reviewing 2 books. One written by, both books about someone's father, one who was exiled from Jaffa to Ramallah, and the other who remained in Israel as one of what they call the 48, the people whose villages were not destroyed in the Nakba. And his description of the struggles that he had, I think is a really, really good descriptive example of what we're talking about when we talk about collective trauma. He said, Palestinians have long argued that the Nakba is not a finite event, but an ongoing process of violent dispossession. Since Zionists started colonizing Palestine at the end of the 19th century, our social fabric as Palestinians has been torn apart, our land occupied, our archives and communal knowledge erased, our loved ones murdered, exiled, or incarcerated, and our people dispersed from their homeland. Now, we know what trauma is. It's a significant injury, either physical or psychological, that has long-term impact on the individual. When we talk about collective or historical trauma, it's more than just the sum of parts. It's more than just collecting everyone's stories. Because what we see with collective trauma or historical trauma is an assault not only on individuals, but on a culture and on a collective people. And it tears apart the fabric of society, as this author is stating here. And societies with a history of trauma are in a constant process of trying to figure out, what does this mean for us? Where do we go from here? Not so much as an attempt to understand what happened in the past, but to figure out what it means for the present. As I said last night, quoting the historian Lucy Davidovich, we look at the past through the prism of the present and try to discern the future. So that's the task that people who have seen the destruction of their society face as they try to put this together. Something else that I mentioned last night was that in forming the state of Israel, the idea was a traumatized people ended up traumatizing the people who lived there before. And that is something that has to be acknowledged. And that aspect of it also fits with collective trauma. Because collective trauma is not limited to the people who suffer. It also affects the people who induce that suffering. And the people who induce the suffering have to deal with that. They have to come to understand how that happened, what does it say about them, and how do they move forward with that. What tends to happen is that those people initially deny that it happened, minimize what happened, or come up with some explanation for how the victims actually caused that to happen. And we see this repeated over and over and over again. So we have these two traumatized people. So the Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of discrimination against the Jewish population by Christians. And it's important to note, they weren't discriminated against by Muslims, as Imam was stating last night. But for Christians, repeated pogroms, forced conversions under torture, isolation in ghettos, restriction from full involvement in society, and whenever anything would go bad, if the crops failed, if disease went through the community, it was almost inevitable that the Jews were going to be blamed for it and pay a price for it. So the Holocaust was not a one-up, but it was exceptional in its ferocity, it was exceptional in its organization, and it was exceptional in how it involved so many people who were bystanders to it and allowed that to happen. So 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis. That's 80% of the European population of Jews. Those who survived were exceptionally traumatized by the event as well. And that doesn't end, but that's another thing about collective trauma. It doesn't end with that generation. It is passed on to subsequent generations because it becomes part of how you identify who you are. Now, when I said that the perpetrators or the bystanders have to deal with this, several years ago, when I was a research assistant with Sam Oliner, I did a study on Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. There's a myth of Jewish passivity in the Holocaust. And myths persist because they serve a lot of purposes. For anti-Semites, it was like, well, what do you expect, right? That's just Jewish people. For the Allies, it gave them cover for not having intervened in a stronger way to stop it. But what's interesting is that it had an effect in Israeli society as well. Because they said, we are going to create a new Jew, one who is militant, one who is strong, and one who will resist any attempts to take us down. And they felt that the European Jewry had allowed this cult. They called it a sheep to the slaughter. It's actually not accurate. It's one of those historical myths. There was a tremendous amount of resistance, but most of it happened in the Soviet Union. And because Jews were transported from the West to the Soviet Union, and because the Cold War started right after World War II, and because Stalin was not about to celebrate Jewish heroes at the time that he was organizing the program against Jews, we didn't get that story. And it didn't emerge until much, much later in archives to document the number of people who joined resistance, who fought against this, and did everything that they could to do it. So you have a society that emerges in Israel that says never again, but that never again has two different meanings. For some people, it's we are going to be so strong and we are going to be so implacable that no one will be able to challenge us. For others, it was because this happened to us, we need to make sure it doesn't happen to other people, right? And of course, Israeli society, depending on which government is in charge, you emphasize one or the other of those. So if we look again, so you have this group that moved there and said, we're going to establish a Jewish state here, and we are going to displace the population of Palestinians here because we can't create a Jewish state. Ben Gurion said, I have 3 goals. I want a Jewish state, I want it in the historic land of Israel, and I want it to be a democracy. And they said, well, we can't do that. We've got a Palestinian population, so we need to dispel. And that was a deliberate policy. Now, there were gangs. There were things that happened that were not under the control of the actual organized Israeli army. But it was still government policy to remove those people. 750,000 people were driven out of their homes. 530 villages were completely destroyed. 15,000 people were killed. If people tried to come back afterwards, they were either killed or forcibly removed. There were a small number of Palestinians who remained in Israel, and they were under military occupation, military government until 1966. They had no freedom of movement. They were actually experiencing something that people in the West Bank today are experiencing as well. So what was the response of Israeli society to the Nakba? Well, part of it was, we will not only remove the people, we will remove their culture. Names of towns and places were changed. Their archives, any historical documents, were removed and destroyed. They were, the language of it, all mentions of Palestine in the history books were removed. Any discussion of the expelling of the Palestinian population wasn't allowed. In fact, as late as 2018, they passed a law that this is kind of like, diversity and inclusion in our schools here. They passed a law that said, if you discuss this in your schools, or refer to the day of the Nakba as a day of mourning, you will lose all funding for your schools. They initially wanted to make it a crime to make that comment, but they didn't end up doing that. So it has been erased from society. How is it possible that you could have people, including the wife of Benjamin Netanyahu, when he met with King Hussein and his wife, to say there was nobody here? It was a land with no people for a people with no land. How did they believe that? Well, if you came after that, if you weren't directly involved, no one was going to really make a point of it in Israeli society. So initially you have denial. Leon Uris, the novelist, wrote a book. And I can't remember the name of the book, I think it's The Hajj. Wrote a book which said all of these people left willingly. They just decided on, and actually their religious leaders told them that they needed to leave. And that was the premise of the book. So, historical myths. The other thing too is to minimize it. To say, there was actually the argument made that all of these people were just migrant workers. They really didn't have any ties to the land. So you have that, we will explain this, or just to simply say, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's what we had to do. So what does that leave the people of Palestine? What does that do to their identity? And it's ongoing, as he points out in this article. And I just want to close with it the way that he closes this article. It says, in Gaza, the Zionist effort to erase Palestine is at its starkest. It's excruciating to witness, even as we know that the Nakba is not confined to the moments of spectacular violence. It persists in the relentless grind of colonization, in our mundane, every routines, and in the ghosts that haunt our domestic lives. We come to see ourselves as part of a multi-generational struggle for a homeland, a struggle that stretches beyond any of our lifetimes, but still shapes our own search for belonging and our most intimate identity of self. That's the challenge. That's what they're facing. Now, it's not uniform within Israeli society. There are groups that recognize this, that acknowledge it. There are psychologists who are studying this and looking at the comparison of it. At the same time that this is going on, there has been a tendency to wipe away the Holocaust on part of some Palestinians, saying it wasn't as severe, or that it wasn't. it was, so initially there were some that said it didn't happen. As there are people in the United States. Recently, Tucker Carlson had someone on that said, well, it was just unfortunate. They just didn't plan enough, and they didn't have enough supplies to feed the Jews, and so, they were just forced to do this. It really wasn't their fault, right? It was just poor planning. So, there is this denial on both sides, because everyone wants to be the victim. When I was presenting a paper on the role of the church in the Holocaust back in the 90s, and there was a Catholic priest in the audience who challenged that and claimed that the Poles were the victims of the Nazis and that they bore no responsibility for the Holocaust. And by the way, there's now a law in Poland that you cannot claim that the Poles coordinated with the Nazis. And someone stood up who was a Holocaust survivor, and he told the story of what it was like for him and how the Poles treated him when he came out of the camps. And so you had this thing where the Catholic priests would say this, and the Holocaust survivors say this, and it was dueling victims, right? And I said, this is not really very helpful, because if you've lost your home, if you've lost your family members, the numbers really don't count. The trauma is there, and the trauma takes its place. So our task, even here from afar, is to acknowledge both sides. To acknowledge that the suffering of both sides affects the behavior of both sides. And figure out some way to channel that trauma, to remember that, to recognize it on both sides, and recognize the need for healing. So I'm not sure if we have any time for questions. How's our time?
We can get a couple minutes.
Okay. Yes.
Hold on, I got you.
You said that there's denial on both sides. One of the reasons being that everyone wants to be a victim.
It's much harder to be to identify yourself as a perpetrator than to identify yourself as a victim. One writer, just said that there's always this challenge that it's much easier to say, I'm an innocent victim, than it is to say, I'm at fault here.
What about the people behind you and the names of children? Would you say those are victims?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a collective societal response to things.
Let's let this person finish their question.
Okay.
Would you say that they're denying anything and they're just wanting to be a victim?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, there are people who are victimized by this. When we're talking about collective trauma, we're talking about how society addresses that, right? And what the psychologists who have looked at this, who have examined this on both sides, have said that each side tends to minimize their part in it and emphasize the other side's part in it. And that's one of the things that allows this to continue.
My other question is, have you ever thought that maybe this situation is like apples and oranges? And one situation doesn't take away from the other? The Holocaust, the Palestinian genocide doesn't take away from the Holocaust that Jewish people and many other people went through. Just like the Holocaust, it doesn't take away from the Palestinian genocide.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Um,
Yes, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, but that's exactly what I'm saying.
I got black cat, and then talking about the black and white cat. You raise your hand. Over there, down now. Let me show you.
Hi, I just have a few questions. I'm curious about what the point of this event is. I'm curious about why it's important to gather to talk.
I'm afraid that's not a question that I can answer.
Well, I'm not done yet. I have a few questions. I'm just going to ask my questions and then sit down.
Okay.
Is it to repeat the same mainstream rhetoric that normalizes genocide? Is it to make us feel better, like we're the good kind of people who get together to discuss the conflict? What is important about sitting here and compassionately psychoanalyzing the Jews in Israel? What about the extreme and ongoing trauma that the Palestinians are enduring at this very moment? What is the point of continuing to center Jews and Israel in these both sides conversations? Is it so we can just keep talking about it without having to do anything until it's over and all the Palestinians have been killed and forcibly removed from their land? And then we can say, we talked about it. Are we in some way playing our part in the finality of evil? After all, Israel is committing massive war crimes, murdering hundreds of thousands of civilians. With our tax dollars, I think. What is our responsibility in this? Maybe instead of centering the trauma of Jews and justifying the existence and savagery of the Israeli state, we should be focusing on the mass and brutal violence and trauma being inflicted on Palestinians right now. That's what this should be about. Like, what's the point of this conversation if it's not about centering the rights of Palestinians? Like this, why are we talking about the Holocaust all the time? Like, yeah, that happened and it was a horrific thing. But like, if someone is raped, do you talk about, he had some problems? No, like, that's wrong what's going on. What's happening is wrong and we need to just focus on that. We should be talking about the crimes that Israel is committing right now and focusing strictly on that and like and the rights that the Palestinians have and how to stop apartheid and dismantle this horrific system that is oppressing people. That's what this should be about. I don't know what this talk is about, just to make us feel better.
Okay, I wanna recenter us real quick and bring us back to the ground rules. I understand again there's like passion and there's gonna be time for us to engage in like discussion. We're trying to make time in the program for that. Please have your questions be questions related to the topic that the speaker is talking about. If you have questions about the intent of the program, you're more than welcome to come up to us organizers at the end, and we'll be more than happy to talk to you all about what the intent of what today is. But I would like to recenter us back on what the conversation is taking place. If you have questions related to what she talked about, I will take them. If not, we're going to move on, and we will not have Q&A. I will shut Q&A down. So if your question is directly related to something that she has stated, and you need clarifying information, please raise your hand. This is not a time to grandstand or do any of those kind of things.
That's something related to me.
I'm making a point. I didn't say, hey, Ellie. I didn't say you. I would have said Ellie. I said, I am reminding everyone, I'm pretty sure I said everyone, of the ground rules. Thank you.
Then let her answer the question.
Ma'am, we're trying to have a conversation, and when you guys do this, it's disruptive, and it's eating into the time that we have here, and it's not productive. I'm gonna be honest with you, it's not.
In your opinion.
It's not productive. I can do a quick, you want me to do a soft poll? Because we can do a soft poll in the room to see if this is productive or not. By show of hands, if you feel like what's happening right now is productive.
What's productive about listening to these lectures about the Holocaust right now?
No one asked anybody to be here tonight. We extended the invitation for those who wanted to take part in the community conversation. And this is a community conversation. And we're just trying to conversate. We can't solve everything in here. We can't. But what we can do is talk to each other in a respectful way where we're not attacking each other, where you're not attacking the words that people are the knowledge. Because it could be somebody who don't know any of what was just stated. And maybe that then encourages them to dive deeper into the words and do their own research.
Yeah, but you're
And
setting
come
the
to
narrative
terms.
for
Ma'am,
everyone in here that's
I'm not setting the
But
narrative.
it's being set.
I'm not setting the
So
narrative.
It's gonna be set and skewed.
I'm not setting the
Right
narrative.
size it.
I'm not setting the narrative.
Then let the question be answered.
She answered the question. But you're arguing with me for no reason. Tom, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I'd like to pose a question in regards to what you were saying in terms of the number of Jews lost in the Holocaust and the subsequent deaths of Palestinians. Let me just frame the question in this way from a personal experience. In 1959, I was at Dachau out of respect to understand what happened. Soon after, I was in Rome and visited the Aventine Caves. This is a cave where the Nazis took 33, reacted to a bombing near Barberini in central Rome, where 333 Nazis were killed. In retaliation, the Nazis gathered up 335 Roman citizens and put them in the cave and blew the cave up. I was then in Palestine 3 months later, and I met a survivor of Dar Yassin, a teacher who had escaped, and I heard that story. And I think that what I'm asking is that when you take the percentage of the people killed October 7th last year, 130, 1,200, and you compare it to the 40,000 of the last count, curiously, when you divide, you'll see that it comes down to one Jew, victim of the Nazis, to 333 of the Palestinians who had suffered in Gaza. And I want to kind of take off from what was said earlier in the sense that that is why we're here. Because I'm closer to 90 than I am 85. And I have not heard this kind of a discussion, and everybody needs to hear it. And I think that please, among those of you who are objecting and see the immediacy of the situation, understand that us older people have not heard this story that I've known, and I haven't heard talked about in all my life until what happened last year.
I would just emphasize again that you shouldn't get into a numbers game because that's not, it's just not helpful. The real problem is, and I would ask people, did you learn anything from me last night or this evening? Raise your hand if you did. Thank you. Because that's the thing, is that, I taught this course several times. And it's a whole semester-long course. And I wish I had the time to do that for you. Because it is so dense and it is so complex. And if you want to understand it, you've got to understand all of that. But I only have 20 minutes. I have to take a little slice of the pie to try to increase people's understanding. And the big thing for me is those historical myths. Because too many people just repeat them, and they never challenge them, and they accept them, and it causes huge problems, and it causes tremendous suffering for people. So that's where I'm coming from.
No more questions.
One more question.
No more questions.
No more.
We're on the tight. Thank you. You are.